Our first speaker today is Dr. Gregory Nobles, Professor Emeritus of History at Georgia Tech. He's a specialist in the American Revolution and the early Republic, and is the author of numerous works, including Whose American Revolution Was It?, who he co-authored with Alfred F. Young, as well as more recent books on John James Audubon and Betsey Stockton. His long career has also included major research fellowships and distinguished scholar appointments, both here in the United States and abroad. Everyone, please help me in welcoming Dr. Gregory Nobles to the Georgia Archives.
Well, thank you, Robin, and thanks all of you for coming out on this beautiful spring and highly pollinated day we have with us here. I'm very happy to be here myself, especially happy to be right here in the archives with archivists. As a historian, I've worked in a lot of archives, worked with a lot of archivists, and I've really come to admire and respect the work they do. They do know their stuff. I can't tell you how many times some archivist has come up to me and said, "Hey, have you looked at this?" And has sent me off in a completely different direction in terms of my research. So I'm very grateful to the archival community. I have to say I have a daughter who's an archivist, so I have a very special place in my heart for that particular archivist. Well, here we are. Here we are in the midst of the celebration or the commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, the semiquincentennial or the sesquicentennial, call it what you will, or we'll just call it the 250th. But what I want to do today is to talk about how we think about this revolution 250 years later, looking back, but also looking forward. And I want to begin with a book, yes, or at least a book cover. That's all you get. The real thing is right here. A book that I wrote some 15 years ago with a late colleague, a very dear man to me, Al Young, called Whose American Revolution Was It? And what the book was about was really how historians have interpreted the revolution over time, from the 20th on through the 21st century. But that's not what I want to talk about today. I don't want to focus on historians and interpretations. I will during the Q&A if you want to, but I really want to think simply just about the question. Whose American Revolution was it? Think about whose American Revolution it is today in 2026 and this year of commemoration, and invite you to think about that as well, not just today, but as you go on from here. So whose American Revolution was it? It was ours. Back in the day, 250 years ago, we fought it, we won it, we beat the Brits, we gained our independence, we became a nation. God bless the USA. That's us now. And today, I think it's still part of who we are as a people. I'm going to give you a very quick story. Some 20 years ago, the archivist's daughter and I went to Philadelphia to Independence Hall. And it was a horrible day. It was late July in Philadelphia. It was muggy. It was rainy. Everybody was sweaty. It was a miserable day, but we got in for the last tour, about 40 of us. And there, the ranger who was going to lead the tour was completely whipped. He had been through it all day long. He was dripping wet. His little Smokey Bear hat was sinking on him. But to his credit, he dutifully did his bit. He took us into the room where the Declaration of Independence had been adopted. And while he was there, he sort of muttered, "You know, this is where he said, we hold these truths to be." And suddenly, all 40 people started reciting the Declaration. They started reciting at least those famous words. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," and they went right on to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I was struck. I was touched. We all know those lines, but to have a group of 40 people literally off the street coming into Independence Hall and being able to recite them, I thought was very striking. Now, we might debate the meaning of those words, but at least we all know the language. It's part of our national vocabulary, part of our cultural memory. Or we think about the Minutemen at Lexington Concord, the first battle of the Revolution on April 19th, 1775. And I bet we all know the words by Ralph Waldo Emerson, by the rude bridge that arched the flood. Their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once in battle farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. Thank you very much. Okay, good. Sorry. Well, there's the embattled farmer at least. And I think we all like to believe that we would have been embattled farmers ourselves. That we would have been there and we would have picked up our gun and gone off to face the Brits because it's how we are. It's who we are, maybe. But here's the question. When we say it's who we are, we have to ask, who are we? And how do we think about the American Revolution, again, some 250 years later? Actually, some of us, I can look out in the crowd and say, some of us remember the bicentennial from 50 years ago in 1976. I know who you are. I was in grad school at the time, and it was a good time for historians. There was a lot of excitement about the revolution, a lot of writing, a little bit of research money. In fact, between 1976 and now, there's been an enormous amount of writing about the American Revolution. This is a display of books, recent books on the American Revolution, and revolutionary figures, individuals, and the larger revolution. This is just an indication of what's out there, and these are books from the last 5 or 10 years. And so we might think, well, maybe it's all done. Maybe everything has been said. What else is there to say? And yet I think there is. I think there is. I'm going to give you 3 quick examples, all from November of 2025. The first one is the Cambridge History of the American Revolution, 3 volumes, 87 essays, and 1,921 pages all told. Some of the works are by older scholars, me, but some are by a number of new scholars, younger people. And I think taken together, it's a very impressive work. The first volume talks about the context of the revolution, the causes, the conflicts, the run-up to the revolution, why and how this event happened, what was going on in American society at the time. Second volume talks about the revolution itself, what happened, looking at from the local to global events, all the mobilizations, the military actions, the politics, and so forth. And finally, the third volume talks about the legacies. And that is the political and social and cultural and racial implications of the revolution down to the current day. It's a remarkable reference work. It offers some fresh perspectives. I don't think it's too heavy a lift intellectually. It is physically, weighs about 6 pounds all told, so but it's all there. It's all there, and I think it gives us a very good indication of where we stand in terms of the current research on the revolution. And I will say, I think it's a very readable set of volumes. There is a more compact, more accessible approach, the Atlantic magazine from November 2025, only 146 pages, 22 essays, most of them 5 to 6 pages long, and a crossword. But there are some fascinating essays in there about King George III, about Thomas Paine, Patrick Henry. There's some essays on Native Americans, or essays on Black loyalists, essays on current day modern revolutionary reenactors, about whom I'll have something to say in a moment. And there's also one essay in there about how do you film the revolution. And it's by this guy called Ken Burns. Sorry, that's the cover. There it is, The American Revolution by Ken Burns. The PBS series that aired back in November, I think it's still on if you have Passport. 6 episodes, 12 hours. Anybody seen it? Okay, good. All of it? It's a workout. And I think, people, you like it, Okay, good. That's good. Okay. I mean, people have their complaints. They have their quibbles. I've got mine, but we can talk about that perhaps during the Q&A period. But I do think it gives us a good visual representation of how we can see the American Revolution today. And yeah, there are lots of battles. There's lots of musket fire. If you've never seen a musket fired, there it is. You can do it. There's a lot of maps and maneuvering. And if your image of the American Revolution is a line of blue guys in blue coats kneeling down, shooting at a line of guys in red coats, there's some of that. But there's a lot more than that, too. Lots of other people. And I think to Burns's credit, all sorts of people. And all sorts of reasons for being in the revolution. Or perhaps not. And so we ask again, whose revolution was it? It was theirs. But it was all of theirs. Different people. Sometimes fighting, I think, different revolutions. And for many, a revolution whether they wanted it or not. And that's what I want us to think about. All those people back in the day. Now, there are a few people I'm not going to talk about, at least right now, and that is the famous people in the pantheon of the American Revolution, Washington and Jefferson and Franklin and Adams and all of that. I'll be happy to talk about them later, perhaps. I acknowledge their importance, to be sure. And I certainly acknowledge the importance of their actions and their ideas. But instead, I want to focus today on ordinary people in the revolution, people like us, and how we see them in the revolution, and perhaps how we see the revolutions in them, the changes that take place in their own lives. And what I want to do is to think about the American Revolution in very basic human terms, to see it as a set of choices, to see it as a crisis. And I think it was a crisis for virtually everybody on the landscape at the time. In fact, I think the best way to see the American Revolution is to see it as a civil war. And that's a term that was used occasionally at the time in the 18th century. It's now been adopted by a number of historians, including me, frankly. Looking at not just the war between the colonies and Great Britain. It's not just the Americans fighting the British, the guys in blue versus the guys in red, but it's Americans fighting each other as well. And we tend to think of those basic divisions, patriot, Tory, or loyalist, and then there's the other group, the neutral, the indifferent, the cautious, the ones who just don't seem to care. You know, John Adams famously estimated about a third of the people at the time were patriots, another third were Tories, and the other third were in that neutral, indifferent category. Actually, today, most historians would adjust those numbers. About a quarter of the American people were patriots, about a quarter were loyalists or Tories, and about a half were on that side of caution, indifference, neutrality, if you will. And yeah, for some of the people, those positions were fixed. We think about patriots who were absolutely committed to the cause. We think about loyalists who were committed to the king or to the British Constitution or to tradition or to economic self-interest. And happily, we'll have two papers tomorrow, portraits of each of those. Nancy Hart, patriot woman, and James Wright, Governor James Wright, a loyalist man. So stay tuned for those. But for many of the people in that third category, the category we might call the neutrals or the neithers, if you will, their position wasn't so much fixed as very fluid. People who would be supporting or at least accommodating the patriot side one day, and they would be supporting or maybe working on the British or the loyalist side the next, or otherwise simply trying to stay out of this conflict. And I think by staying out or staying neutral, they weren't just being devious or cowardly or cynical. They're trying to survive. They're trying to survive. And that's a very human experience, I think, to a suddenly menacing situation. how to survive when war comes right to your home. We see it on TV every night, and we can see it in our country 250 years ago. So I want to offer a couple of examples about that. There is a wonderful exhibit by the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia about Philadelphia, the revolutionary city. And it raised a very important question that doesn't get asked very often. And that is, what happens? What happens when your hometown is occupied by the enemy, if in fact you consider them to be the enemy? You know, we think a lot about the occupation of Paris in the early 1940s during the Nazi era. But what about the 1770s, when the British come to our towns, whether it's Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, Charleston, or Savannah? And the British have guns, the British have men, and the British have money. And that's an important issue. They have real money, gold and silver, not the kind of paper scrip that the colonists have. And so when the British come to town, what do? Do you resist? Do you acquiesce? Do you collaborate? Or do you celebrate? Well, for some loyalists, some Tories in Philadelphia, it could be literally a time to celebrate. On the far side over there is a ticket to a dance, a big party called the 𝘞𝘩𝘰𝘴𝘦 that took place in 1778. It was a party that involved British officers and the elite loyalists in Philadelphia. One of the party goers here was Margaret Peggy Shippen. There she is in her party dress and hairdo. She was the daughter of a very wealthy Philadelphia merchant, Edwin Shippen. She became later the second wife of Benedict Arnold, so you begin to see where she is. But for most other women in Philadelphia, ordinary women, it was no party at all. They're trying to work with, they're trying to work around the British. And politics aside, it's a real problem. It's a very immediate problem for people who are trying to keep their families together. Suddenly you have several thousand soldiers in town, and they have to eat, and they have to sleep somewhere. And the army always gets first dibs on the good stuff. And so women, whether their husbands are around or not, their husbands might be off fighting somewhere, or they might have just gone away. It's the women who really bear the brunt of that experience. And they have to find ways to survive. They have to find ways to get food for their family. They have to find ways to keep their children safe. And sometimes they have to deal with British officers living in their houses. I'm actually happy to say there's a new book about all this that just appeared, a book called The Home Front by a young scholar named 𝘈𝘮𝑗𝑑𝘮𝑉𝑎𝑙. I have cradled the table of contents in my hand. I look very much forward to reading it. And yet, that aside, I still think we need to know more about the occupation of American cities and towns in the 1770s. And ask, what did people do? How did they get by? And then what happened when things went back to normal? When the British left, and suddenly, what do you say to the neighbors who might have betrayed the cause? There's the other side of the occupation as well. While the British Army was in Philadelphia in 1777 and 78, George Washington and his army were out 20 miles away at Valley Forge. 20 miles away, but 1,000 miles away in terms of comfort. There were some 14,000 people at Valley Forge, and this is soldiers, but also women and children as well, because many soldiers brought their families along. 14,000 people. That encampment was the fourth largest concentration of human beings in North America. After Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, it was the fourth biggest city, if you will, but people living for the most part out of doors. And yeah, we know the Valley Forge story. People are freezing, people are sick, people are hungry. And yet we have to ask, well, how did they get by? I had an experience of going to a talk recently by a man who was the baker at Mount Vernon now. And I have to admit, I didn't expect too much. Talk about making bread by the baker at Mount Vernon. But I went, and actually it turned out to be a terrific talk. I got a lot out of it. And one thing I got was the notion that the Army at Valley Forge, Washington's Army, needed 6,000 to 8,000 pounds of bread a day. A day. You think of that. Where does all that bread come from? Well, it comes from the bakers. It comes from the big ovens that they made, and it comes from enlisting lots of individual soldiers to line up at the kneading trough and make the bread. But it's a question of trying to feed an army day after day when the resources are very limited. And as soon as you ask, where does the bread come from, you have to ask, well, where does the grain come from? Where does the flour come from? Well, it comes from local farmers. It comes from local millers, some of whom might be good patriots, loyal to the cause, committed to your well-being. Others, though, might prefer doing business with the British, because the British have real money. They have gold and silver. And so it really struck me. Suddenly, there it is, a fairly prosaic issue. How do you make bread for the Army at Valley Forge? But I think it leads to a much larger logistical and political issue. You begin to think about supply chain, if we can use a modern term. You begin to think about who's committed to the cause, whose allegiance is where. And you begin to think about following, as always, the money. And that's military history too. It's not just marching into battle. It's not just drawing up lines. It's not just shooting. It's the day-to-day survival of soldiers. And in this case, of course, their families as well. Now, those are the soldiers we know well, the British in Philadelphia, the American Army at Valley Forge. I think too of other sorts of soldiers, black soldiers especially, and soldiers who fought on either side. And we have to ask, fought for what? For them, the issue wasn't taxation or representation. The issue was emancipation. Not national independence, but personal independence. And whoever offered that, there they would go, if they could get there. Really, the first example came in November of 1775, when Lord Dunmore, the last British governor of Virginia, said that all able-bodied enslaved men who would fight for the British would be given their freedom. Now, Lord Dunmore was no abolitionist. He was a slaveholder himself. But he needed men. And he needed some way to scare the colonists. And that was a good one. Especially in the South, especially in places like South Carolina, where black people were the majority of the population. And suddenly the notion of black men with guns that terrified white people. In fact, in 1775, after Dunmore made this proclamation about bringing black men into the British Army, Washington said that Dunmore was the most dangerous man in America. But hundreds of black people, black men especially, saw the opportunity. Maybe 1,500 men. Again, the numbers are a little bit sketchy. Anytime I use numbers today, they're going to be an estimate. But 1,500 men, and perhaps their wives and children too, came to Dunmore, and they formed a unit called the 𝘞𝘩𝘰𝘴𝘦 Regiment. And they fought. And they fought wearing a sash, and you can see liberty to slaves. Imagine for a minute, what was it like for a black man who had been enslaved to put on that sash and to pick up a gun? Also imagine what it felt like to be a white man and see that man coming after you. And I think that was a critical moment. Well, at the time, George Washington, again, another Virginia slaveholder, had to think about black soldiers in his army. And at first, when Washington took command in July of 1775 up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, one of his first acts was to get rid of the black soldiers in his army. He wanted an all-white Continental Army. But then, by December of 1775, he changed his mind. He realized that he too needed men. And so he adjusted his stance, said he would take free blacks into the army, but still not enslaved blacks. But then in 1778, during the Valley Forge winter, that changed too. Washington still needed men. And he got some more. He got some more black men. The state of Rhode Island reinforced a regiment using black soldiers, both free and enslaved, and offered freedom to the enslaved soldiers if they would fight. And they fought very, very well. I have to say that was the last time that the United States had a racially integrated regiments until the Korean War. And in the end, maybe some 18 to 20,000 black soldiers served with the British. Again, the numbers are a little bit sketchy. Maybe 9,000 or so for the Americans. And that's out of a population of 500,000, 500,000 black people in the United States at the time. So maybe that's not a lot. But on whatever side, I think these soldiers gave new meaning to the idea of fighting for liberty. And this afternoon, I think we'll get a case study of Austin Dabney, one of those black men who was fighting for liberty, his own liberty as well as the national liberty. When we think about other sorts of people in the fight, we have to think about indigenous people, or peoples plural, because they're not all one group. And if we shift our focus away from the colonies along the East Coast, the cities and the communities that we seem to know so well, we see Native groups in the interior. And of course, Native people were not asking for another war. They've been fighting wars throughout the 18th century. They didn't need another one. Most of them who did fight fought on the side of the British. There were a few exceptions. But really, I think they fought for themselves. That is, they weren't fighting because of love or loyalty to the king. They had loyalty to their own people, defense of their own homeland. They're trying to keep the Euro-Americans from. Now, I have to say the history of indigenous people in the Revolution is a very, very complicated diplomatic story, and I'm not going to try to unpack it today. There are various shifts and alliances. It's another very fluid situation, but one thing is certain, and that is the role of Native American people in the Revolution created fear and anxiety on the Patriot side, just as had been the case, I think, with black soldiers. And it may have created a new form of warfare among the Patriots themselves. In 1776, in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson complains of the vicious sort of fighting carried on by what he calls the merciless Indian savages. And that's the 27th of the 27 grievances in the Declaration. After all the highfalutin language about life and liberty, there's a list of grievances, all the things the king has done. And this is one of them. And maybe it's listed last for more emphasis. But then in 1779, in the most famous example of atrocity on the Patriot side, George Washington orders General John Sullivan, as he says, to lay waste to the Haudenosaunee villages in New York. That's the Six Nations, what we used to call the Iroquois Confederacy. And Washington also orders Sullivan, as he writes, to reject any overture of peace before the total ruin of their settlements is effected. No ceasefire until the work is done. You can call it scorched earth. You can use the Vietnam terms, pacification, search and destroy. It was a brutal campaign. And for that, Washington got the name Town Destroyer from the Haudenosaunee. Now, at this point, maybe the question isn't so much whose revolution was it, but whose savage warfare was it? And for Native Americans, it wasn't even the revolution at all. That is, the end of the revolution didn't end for them. When the revolution ended for the white Americans in 1783, that was just the beginning of a new phase of fighting for Native Americans. And in 1784, the new American government, just over its victory against the British, has already started making plans for the land beyond the original 13 colonies, drawing boxes on the map. States come into the Union. Not paying much attention to who's already there, not having much concern for any of that. This is where we're going. This map might be a good place actually to pause. I mean, I know I've moved quickly over a large landscape, flying at the proverbial 30,000 feet. But my point is, we need to take that view sometimes. We need to take that view from the big picture and then zoom in to the local level. Get our eyes off the usual subjects, get our eyes off the usual suspects, some of those leading figures in the revolution. Get away from the usual scenes, the Battle of Lexington and Concord perhaps, and the usual stories. And look all over and begin to look closely. And remember that wherever we look for the effects of the revolution and the effect the revolution had on people all across the eastern part of what's now the United States. One of those effects is liberation, for sure. Both national liberation and, for many people, again, individual liberation. But there's also a good deal of desolation. There's that too, and everywhere. How many people died in the American Revolution? We don't really know. Estimates range from 25,000 to about 30,000 to 40,000. But that was about maybe 1.5% of the colonial population at the time. You put that in today's terms, and that'd be 3.5 to 5 million people killed. Can we imagine a war like that? Can we imagine a war like that on our own homeland? Well, speaking of today, I want to close with my second question, not just whose revolution was it, but whose revolution is it now? And of course, it is still ours. It's still ours. And the question is what we do with it for this 250th commemoration or celebration. I'm going to offer 3 suggestions. One of them is just get out to some public events with your fellow Americans, celebrate, have some fireworks, have some fun. There's a suggestion of where you can go, different cities. This is from AARP magazine, one of my favorite publications, and I'm sure some of yours too. I'll also say I live part of the year in a small town in northern Michigan, and there's been a custom for the past 9 years, I think, where somebody reads the Declaration of Independence from the post office steps at 10 o'clock in the morning on July 4th. This is a friend of mine who does it. He does it in costume, does it in character, and he reads the Declaration all the way down to the end, all those 27 grievances. And it's quite a moving moment. It's a wonderful communal activity when people show up. Well, if you can't get someone to read the Declaration to you, you can read it yourself. Here's an easy start. 109 pages, less than $4. 3 critical foundational documents. The first is the Declaration. And I think it is worth a read. It is worth a read because we know it so well, and yet we don't really read it. And I think it's something that's important to read. And again, if you read the Declaration and read those 27 grievances, you'll find some of them are remarkably resonant today. And I'll ask that's your reading assignment for the afternoon. Another of these documents you don't know so well is the Articles of Confederation. And by reading that, you can see what were some of the problems of running the government during a revolution. And in this case, the government was literally on the run. The Congress moved from Philadelphia to Baltimore, to Lancaster, PA, to York, PA, back to Philadelphia, eventually Princeton, New Jersey. Congress was always on the run, trying to stay one step ahead of the British. But the Congress couldn't run without the cooperation of the several states, and many of the states didn't do much to cooperate. They didn't provide money. They didn't provide military manpower. I will tell you, I'm working on a piece now about asking what if the founders had decided to create just the United States, singular, of America, not have the individual states anymore. They were British creations. Why not just get rid of them? And so we'll see. Stay tuned. That's coming. And then there's a third document, one at the top, that keeps popping up from time to time in the news these days. It's the United States Constitution. It's worth a read. It's about how our government works, or it's supposed to work. And there's your reading assignment. But finally, one thing I think we all need to do is to pay attention to how the revolution is remembered, especially about the memorials that'll stay in place after the celebrations are over, after 2026. I'm giving you two recent examples, both from the United States Park Service. This is a statue of Caesar Rodney. He was a Delaware delegate to the Continental Congress. And on July 1st, 1776, Rodney was back in Delaware. He was deathly sick. He was in bed. His doctor said, stay in bed, don't get up, don't go anywhere. And Rodney said, I'm gone. He did. He got on his horse, he rode overnight, rode to Philadelphia, cast his vote for independence. And in that level, it's a great story. But back in Delaware, he didn't grant independence to the 200 or so people he kept enslaved on his plantation. And Rodney was among the 24 or so of the 56 signers of the Declaration who held human property. So in 2020, the statue was taken out of public view, mothballed, if you will. But now in 2026, the Park Service is bringing it back. They're putting it in a prominent place in Washington, D.C. Apparently, they're going to put it in Freedom Plaza, which is a park honoring Martin Luther King. Then up in Philadelphia, the Park Service had removed some memorials recently. These were plaques about people who had been in George Washington's house, enslaved by Washington while he was president in the 1790s. And it's about 2 blocks from Independence Hall. It's all part of this large complex there. And these plaques have been on display since 2002. But in February of this year, February 2026, the Park Service crowbarred them off. Now, since then, a judge has ruled that the plaques will be put back up, but I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. And there you have it. These issues aren't over. The history of the American Revolution isn't over. Despite all the outpouring of writing, it's still very much with us. And the issue for me is that we need more history, not less history. History we find inspiring, but history we might also find very troubling. And we need to think about how the present connects to the past. We need to see ourselves in connection with the people in the past, the people in history then. And we need to see ourselves as people in history now. We're not in a civil war, I hope, but we are divided. And this semiquincentennial may heighten some of those divisions. But it may also remind us of what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature as a nation, as a people. And for Lincoln, those angels trace their roots back to the American Revolution. And so I hope we still hold on to some of those old truths about liberty, about equality. I hope we still cherish our commitment to both. And I hope we can keep that commitment beyond 2026. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. So at this time, we're going to go ahead and take questions. I'm going to hand off the microphone to whoever has a question as we go. So if anybody has any questions, if you want to raise your hands. Yeah. All right, I'm going to get Bob Davis, and I'll come back up front.
I'm very much enjoying your talk, and it goes with some work I'm doing right now, where I point out that while Boston was critical to the American Revolution, each of the 12 colonies that became the 13 states, each was following their own route to independence. And at that moment, the British had lost the war. You mentioned Ken Burns' documentary. Another documentary made with a lot less money is being shown right now on PBS, and it's first rate, and that's Lucy Worsley's Investigates the American Revolution. And in fact, I like it a lot better than Ken Burns' documentary. But anyway, I thought I would mention that.
Yeah, I saw a little bit of that last night, as a matter of fact. She's traveling back and forth between London and Boston, always wearing bright red dresses. Yeah, it's worth a look.
There's someone up here at the front. Do you have a question?
Yeah, how you doing?
Hi.
My question was, so even after the American Revolutionary War, the British were still coming here to do trade and do business. I was under the impression, I thought like after the war, we kicked them out, they was going completely. So just to hear that and just to learn, which is phenomenal. I appreciate you teaching that. So I really didn't know that the British were still here after 1776.
Yeah, they hung around in a number of places. Not so much, the map is gone, not so much in the coastal areas, but in the interior, up in parts of Michigan. The United States, the new United States didn't have the power to push them out. There was a treaty and said the British would evacuate, but they didn't. And I think that, we have a tendency to think that, okay, the treaty is signed, it's all over, and then life goes on. Well, life does go on, but I think that the treaty is language, it's a document, but the reality on the ground is something different. And I think that, again, this is what I mentioned about for Native peoples in the interior. The war wasn't over, but it was actually beginning to scale up. And from 1784 on through, pick your end date, there's constant fighting. And so we like to think and compartmentalize things. Here's the war, here's the treaty, it's over. It's not. And I think we've seen that, frankly, in our own lives too.
Doing genealogy, I found a lot of ancestors that were very interesting. One was John Gritton. He was my fourth great grandfather. And he was with Washington at Monmouth, which was supposed to be one of the larger battles of the Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
He may have been at Valley Forge, but I'm not sure. But his commander Shreve was there. And then he was with George Rogers Clark out in Ohio for two invasions against the Shawnee Indians.
Yeah.
And you were talking about the destruction and such. They cut down 800 acres of corn during that.
Yeah.
My question is, did you do much research about the Haitian soldiers that were brought in here from the French?
Well,
I think they were Hussars.
yeah, they were brought in to Savannah, and they played a very critical role. The ability of the United States Army and the Continental Army to attract allies, especially French allies, was, I think, critical to the victory. And the Haitian soldiers who came here came at the behest, the insistence of the French. And yet, of course, the next great revolution after ours, along with the French, was the Haitian Revolution.
Yes.
Something that's getting a lot more attention now than it had 20 or 30 years ago. I think one thing too about, Black soldiers, a large number of the soldiers, Black soldiers who fought with the British, joined them in evacuation. And so they left. They were not going to be very popular people staying around in the new United States. They left with the British first to Nova Scotia. The white loyalists were not very excited to have them there. Many wound up going to London, then to Sierra Leone, which was a British colony created in Africa for emancipated slaves. A good number went to Jamaica, and some even wound up going as far as Australia. And that was in the 1780s. And so there's a kind of reverse diaspora, if you will, of African American, or I'll just say Black soldiers, not coming from east to west, but going back east and literally around the world. It's a fascinating story, and one that doesn't get told very much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Greg, so I thought that was a great talk, and thank you for it. You alluded to what the park rangers are doing to de-emphasize Black people in the revolution.
Yeah.
And I have a question about what's coming. I can't imagine that the current administration is going to do anything except cheapen what the revolution was all about.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine we're going to be hit with a tidal wave of puffery. And I'm just curious, what are American historians preparing for that and thinking about how to counteract some of what's coming?
Well, yeah, I think we have been a number of ways. We still keep writing, we still keep talking. Can't stop that. Well, all right. Stop at one. Okay. No, I think it's a real problem. And this is why I asked, whose revolution is it? Who controls the revolution? And there might be rather large and elaborate military parades. I don't know. I've heard there's going to be NASCAR in the streets of Washington, D.C. I don't know. But what I do know is that we as citizens have to remember the revolution in our own ways. And this is why I say it's worth studying still. It's worth reading some of those documents. It's worth becoming familiar, not just with the language we all know, but maybe some of the issues we don't know. And yes, historians as a profession are trying to do their right thing, but that's historians as a profession. I think the much more critical thing is just how ordinary people, the likes of us, who are not card-carrying PhD historians, everybody has the right to, at least so far, everybody has the right to interpret the revolution and to celebrate it, but also to think about it and to talk about it. And I'm hoping in the next number of months between now and July 4th, and certainly beyond that we do have a number of fairly robust conversations about what this means. And sometimes, yeah, you go to a historical site and say, where are the plaques? What happened? Other times you might sit around reading through the grievances of the Declaration of Independence and say, wow, I didn't know that. Can you think of it? So, nobody owns the revolution. We all do.
The gentleman asked about the Haitian soldiers who served in the French army at Savannah in 1779. There's a very good article on it in the free online journal, the Journal of the American Revolution. Okay. And an article on that is about to appear in the Journal of African American Genealogy and History, which is due out at any moment. Also, the free online Journal of the American Revolution has lots of good articles on African Americans in the American Revolution, all fully documented. And next time you're in Savannah, be sure to see the Haitian Soldiers Monument in Savannah, which is a wonderful piece of sculpture. And I should say some of them deserted from the French army and remained in Georgia, just as many of the African Americans who served with the British also stayed in Georgia after the Revolution. And if we had some way of doing a DNA test, we'd probably find many African Americans today whose ancestors go back to all of these African Americans.
They just won't get into the DAR, that's all.
Hi, I enjoyed that. I'm wondering, as far as the Ken Burns American Revolution production that he did, I enjoyed watching it, but I remember when I was watching it, I was thinking, I wouldn't have gone that direction with that topic or whatever. I can't remember what they were now because that was, 4 months ago. But I was wondering what you said you had some issues with it or had some thoughts about it. I was wondering what those are.
Well, they're quibbles, I suppose. My wife and I did dutifully watch. We broke it up into 30-minute chunks so we could do it. I thought if you like military history, it's very good. And, he did a very fine job of showing the maps and the battles and so forth. But one area I think that he didn't do quite as well was the home front, civilians, especially when, as I mentioned earlier, when one army or the other, is in your neighborhood, is in your village, is in your town or city. What does that do to people's lives? And I think that that's hard for a filmmaker, I think, to portray. It's easier to put up arrows on a map and show the lines that are moving and, all that kind of thing. And of course, there are a lot of historical reenactors that he could rely on. I showed you the image of the historical reenactors in the Ethiopian regiment in Virginia and Rhode Island. Those were not photos from the 1770s, okay? And yet, what I like about historical reenactors is that they really pay a lot of attention to detail, getting things right, down to the very, shoelaces on their uniforms, if you will. And so I think Burns did a fine job of showing real people, in uniform marching around. I think if you ask me, I would have had a little bit less of the battlefield history, but more of the kind of social history, if you will. But that's just me.
Enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
I've been tracing some families that were in Georgia during that time and been struck by how the events of the South seem to be neglected by a lot of people writing about the American Revolution. And in the backcountry of Georgia in particular, it was extremely violent.
Yes.
But what has struck me is how many of the loyalists were reintegrated into Southern society relatively easily when you compare it to events after the American Civil War, where the bitterness just persisted for years. I'm wondering if that's your impression or if I'm just looking at families that are skewed in some way.
I would never say that. Well, I think that what was different in the American Revolution as opposed to the Civil War is that the Civil War was largely, not completely, but largely regional. It was, yeah. I mean, there were people in Georgia who, opposed the Confederacy, but that's something else. During the Revolution, there were some very vicious battles carried out by neighbor against neighbor. Kings Mountain, probably the most notable of that. And, there's always the assumption that maybe people are using this context to settle old scores with people they disagreed with, people they had prior arguments with. And this notion about fighting for the king or fighting for the patriots, that was quite often a convenient way of coming against your neighbors or erstwhile neighbors and taking out some vengeance upon them. civil wars are always very complicated issues. And, you know, if you think about warfare, if you think about military history, it's people wearing one kind of uniform going after people, another kind of uniform, that just falls apart. It's especially when you get it down into the local level, the militia level, the kind of internecine struggles that go on. You know, we like to think of the revolution as a kind of parade ground exercise, people marching out, kneeling down, shooting, and getting up and going away. It wasn't that. It was a very savage, violent war. Made all the more so by a lot of it was carried out, a lot of the killing was carried out with cold steel. And I think that's something we have to recognize. We can't lose sight of the fact that that for all the celebratory aspects of the American Revolution, there is this violent struggle, and some of it is absolutely, yeah, savage.
A lot of the fighting fortune is between militia and the wolves.
Yeah.
All of it was done in communities.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, the militia were enormously unreliable militarily, but they were quite often very eager militarily as well.
Yeah. So this will be our last question for Dr. Nobles.
If you're not opposed to walking 200 miles, you can go on the Over Mountain Victory Trail from Abington, Virginia, down to Kings Mountain National Battlefield. So if you're interested in a long walk, and I did it 4 times,
Really?
and yeah, and the first time I got my boots wet, and I went to moccasins, and oh, good gravy, it was bad on my feet. So anyway, a lot of militia groups from Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia,
Yeah.
all banded together to meet Patrick Ferguson on the top of the mountain. And he was the only person who came from Britain. All the others were loyalists from, I think, New York and New Jersey, maybe some from the Carolinas. And it was really a wonderful victory for us, the Americans, patriots,
Yeah.
because of so many of the British dying. About 250 died, I think it was, to about 30 patriots.
Sounds like a good walk.
Thank you, Dr. Nobles.
Thank you.
That was excellent.